Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Dean's Lecture Series here at Carnegie Mellon University in Qatar. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the guests, Your Excellencies, Minister. It is wonderful to see such a large and enthusiastic crowd out today. I'm Michael Trick. I'm the Dean here at CMUQ, and I'm really pleased that all of you have chosen to come out here today. As our semester began in August, we learned from our friends at the U.S. Embassy in Qatar that Dr. Mary Ellen Weber was coming to Doha. We were delighted to work with the embassy to bring Dr. Weber here today to speak to us. Dr. Weber is a veteran astronaut, executive, strategist, and technologist. Selected in the 14th group of NASA astronauts, she served for 10 years and is the veteran of 2 space flights. She is one of the youngest astronauts to ever venture into space, traveling 297 Earth orbits and 7.8 million miles. She remains involved with NASA as a member of the NASA Advisory Council Committee on Technology, Innovation, and Engineering. Dr. Weber holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from Purdue, an MBA from Southern Methodist University, and a PhD in Chemistry from UC Berkeley. I'd also like to mention that Dr. Weber is a competitive skydiver with nearly 6,000 skydives and 24 U.S. national championship medals. So today, Dr. Weber is a consultant in technology innovation, strategic communication, and high-risk operations through her company, Stellar Strategies. Before I invite our speaker to the podium, I'd like to welcome members of the media. Thank you very much for coming out. We're delighted to have you here today. Just a gentle reminder that the question and answer portion of today's talk is for members of our community and our guests. Members of the media are welcome to approach Dr. Weber when we break for lunch. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Ellen Weber to the Dean's Lecture Series.
So before I can talk about leadership lessons from space, I want to take a moment and first talk about how we get to space, because I think this is a greatly misunderstood idea. Most people think, and it's a very important idea, most people think that we go into space by going up very high. If I have a big rocket engine and I go very high, I go hundreds of kilometers up, I'll be in space. Well, that's technically true. You would be there, but only momentarily. You see, very, very quickly, this large force of gravity that keeps us on the Earth would pull us right back to Earth. So we don't go into space by going up high. We get there by going fast, crazy fast, blazing fast. So think about it this way. If you've ever thrown a ball, a soccer ball, say, in a straight line, you know what happens. You know that the force of gravity will pull that ball from its straight line and it'll go into a curve and fall right back onto Earth. It turns out the faster you throw that ball, the larger that curve gets. So you could throw a ball or an astronaut or a spacecraft so fast that the size of that curve is actually larger than the size of the Earth. Gravity would still be pulling on it, but it would miss. It would just go around and around the world. And that's how we go into space. So how fast do you have to throw a ball or an astronaut or a spacecraft to get it to go around and around the world instead of hitting the Earth? 28,000 kilometers per hour. 25 times the speed of sound. This is so fast that when you're going in space, you go around the world every 1.5 hours. And it's very unforgiving. In fact, when you want to come home from space, all we do is slow down by 1%. So for the students out there, when your teachers and your faculty are telling you that you have to give 100%, there is no better example than when you're trying to get into space. The reason why this is an important concept to understand is that need for speed is what drives, it's the source of all the risk in going into space. So think about it. You need crazy, immense, huge power to get anything going that fast. You essentially need a controlled explosion to go that fast. In the shuttle, when we would march out to the launch pad, out to our bomb that was sitting out there, understand how dangerous it was. Even the rescue crews were 3 miles away. And things are changing. You're not just instantly going 25 times the speed of sound. You start out at 0 and you work your way up. So that means things are changing very, very quickly while you're trying to accelerate to that speed so that you can stay in space. So that acceleration going from 0 to 25 times the speed of sound means that if you have a problem, you have to act very quickly. In fact, with the space shuttle, we had 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's it. You had to figure out what was wrong, figure out what to do, and do it within that time frame, or else you weren't coming home. And so that decision time frame is what makes going into space so different. It means the reason why there are lessons from space on decision making, it applies to any situation in which you have to make a decision fast and the stakes are enormously high. So in the space world, what that means is that we have to practice making those decisions. There was some research that was done in a book published in 1990 called Sources of Power, in which they looked at the way people who have to make high-stakes decisions very quickly, looked at the way they do that, the way their brains work. And it turns out in that situation, our brains, the human brains, operate very differently. When we have time to make decisions, we evaluate options. We say, well, I can do this. If I'm buying a house, I could buy this house or that house or that house, and you weigh the pros and the cons, and you make a very deliberate decision. When time is short, our brains don't work that way. Our brains work where we stop at the first reasonable answer or seemingly reasonable answer. We stop processing, and we stick with that answer to the end. And you'll see this in business with mergers and acquisitions. You'll see once people have made a decision, there's a bubble, there's an investment decision. Even when information comes to light that that may not be the best decision, they will stick through it to the end. I know in my own experience with skydiving, I've seen it, I've experienced it myself. When you have a malfunction, actually deciding to go to your reserve, even when it turns out that isn't working out so well. I remember having the thought, I am going to cut away this parachute. They will find my hand trying to cut away this parachute. They'll find me. It worked out. I was able to get rid of the bad chute and go to my reserve chute with a few seconds to spare. But I lived it. I have been giving this talk for a number of years, and then I had the chance to experience that decision process in action. And the other thing that's really different about leadership and governance and decision making with respect to space is that there is a lot of bureaucracy around that. When you're trying to send things into space, humans into space, humans to the moon, humans to Mars, it takes a lot of money, and it takes a lot of people and a lot of decision makers. And that bureaucracy actually is a huge factor when you're trying to, whether it's lead an organization in that endeavor or trying to make decisions. And so those two things are what I want to talk about with respect to lessons in space. making decisions, how you prepare for that, to make decisions that are high stakes and make them quickly. And the second thing is, what is important about leadership when you're trying to make changes in a very entrenched industry surrounded by bureaucracy? Now, I learned a long time ago that it's really, no matter what you're talking about with space, what really everybody cares about is what it's like to fly in space. So I do want to talk about that a little bit to show you my experiences with space, and before I talk about lessons from space. Now, one of the things, I've talked about this need for speed and the decision-making time frame. But you have to understand, when I talk about high stakes and high risk, just how risky going to space really is. On my first flight, we were told that the odds of not coming home, of having a catastrophic accident with the space shuttle, was 1 in 100. By my second flight, they improved the main engines, and so it was a little bit better. It was about 1 in 250. In reality, out of 100 shuttle missions, we lost 2. We lost 2 crews and 2 vehicles, and so it was really about 1 in 50. So I'm talking about a lot of numbers here. What does that mean? So I lived in Texas, in Dallas, Texas, for a number of years. So I did the math at that one airport, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. If airlines had the same accident rate, the same risk as going into space, there would be 10 catastrophic airline crashes at that one airport every single day. There would be hundreds and thousands around the world every single day. I think if that were the case, I think video conferencing would be a lot more popular than it is today. And so when you're going into space, you know this, and you prepare to not come home. You have to designate a person in the astronaut office to be your family's point of contact to help them both through the logistics and the grief. Ironically, NASA's life insurance policy excludes spaceflight. Think about that. So one of the things NASA does for you is they schedule the appointment for you with Lloyd's of London so you can go buy your own life insurance. But even with all of that, I would say as you're preparing for a launch, your biggest fear is not that you won't come home. Your biggest fear is that you may not come home because of something you did or did not do. You have your crew members relying on you. You have the entire organization. You have thousands of people who have devoted years of their lives for this mission to be successful. And how tragic if you did not live up to that. And so the day before launch, that's what you're thinking about. Is there something else I can review? Is there something else that I can study? Because in fact, training for a space flight is 99% studying, learning, practicing. It's not physical. It is knowing every nut and bolt, every wire, every algorithm in the computers. It's knowing all that so that when those 5 seconds start counting off, you as a crew will have the knowledge to perform, and you will have the relationship and the trust in mission control on the ground to help you through that. So certainly the risk of going into space is one aspect that's an important thing. The other thing, of course, is weightlessness. Now, of course, you still have weight, and there's still gravity, as I talked about earlier, but you're accelerating with these powerful explosives as you're going from 0 to 25 times the speed of sound. Once those engines shut off, you are in free fall. You are now falling towards the Earth, but you're going so fast that you miss it. But what that means is inside your spacecraft, you're floating around. Now, it can be a lot of fun, floating around. It's kind of hard on your body. Our bodies have evolved over millions of years to use this big force of gravity, and so there's a lot of interesting changes. It's also very annoying. I mean, even simple things, whether it's brushing your teeth or whatever that we don't even think about, ends up being an ordeal up in space. And you take the cap off the toothpaste, you turn around, you can't put it down, right? It's floated away, and there you are looking for it. On both of my missions, we lost 2 tiny critical pieces of equipment, and we were desperately looking around trying to find them before we had to confess to the ground that we had lost this. In both cases, we found it. I remember on my second flight, I looked over, and there, floating above the toilet, was this piece of equipment. Who knew that's where all the airflow was taking it? In fact, you know, on the space station, they are finding things that they had lost 8 years ago. 8 years ago. So, as much fun as weightlessness is, it's also pretty annoying. The other thing that comes to mind when I think about going into space is, of course, looking at our beautiful planet. The thing that really struck me is that when I think of our world, and I think this is true for everybody, when you look at a globe or a map, you think of the boundaries. You think this country ends here. Where is this country? Where is this country? Where is this city? And you're thinking about it in terms of where the borders are. And then you get into space, and you look at this sun shining on a planet, and you can't see the borders. All you see is land and water, and it is truly a planet. And for me, I thought of us all, you know, as Earthlings. I mean, the divisions go away, and I think that's one of the great opportunities in going into space. With that, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I actually have a video that is some shots from 2 of my flights. One was in 1995, and the other was in 2000. And that second one was it was the 3rd construction flight for the International Space Station. Now, the space station, I think, is probably, I'm certain of it, the most amazing engineering feat ever accomplished by human beings. To assemble this orbiting laboratory is incredible, and I was honored to have been on the 3rd mission to put together the space station. This had been orbiting around the planet over a year. Nobody had been there. It was out of a science fiction movie where you connect with an empty spacecraft, open the hatch, and wonder what you will find. So the space shuttle is the white thing that would orbit around the planet. But that was only part of what our launch was. We, of course, needed those explosives. We needed that power to get us going fast enough. So we were strapped to a big orange fuel tank that contained liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. And that fuel was burned in 3 engines at the bottom of the white space shuttle itself. Oh, there we go. Now, the space shuttle, and those were right at the bottom, were attached to that fuel tank. The crew compartment is only at the nose of the shuttle. It's the size of maybe 2 closets. That's what we would live in and work in for days at a time. Now, that hydrogen and oxygen in the orange tank would provide most of the power to get us going fast enough, but we still needed more. So you'll see that there were 2 solid rockets strapped to the orange tank. They're called solid rockets because the fuel is solid. It's funny to think about. If you light a solid rocket, there is no turning it off. You are committed. So when we walk out to this, what is essentially a bomb, understand that even if we have a problem right after launch, we have to keep going, get it into space, use up the fuel before we even have a chance to come back home and land safely back on Earth. Now, if you could start the video, that'd be great. Now, we wear these survival suits. They actually have helmets and gloves. They would seal up. There's no air in space, so if we had a hole in our crew compartment, they would inflate and hopefully keep us alive long enough for us to fix the problem and make it back into the atmosphere. Now, those are the 3 engines that were attached to the bottom of the white shuttle, and those were ignited 6 seconds before launch. But the real launch happened when those solid rockets were ignited. So you're at the very top in that nose of the shuttle. You're on a seat, but you're not sitting. You're lying on your back. You're lying on top of a parachute. You have oxygen bottle, a life raft, a survival kit, because you may have to jump out. And all this shaking and shuddering, there are G-forces going through your chest. You have to work to breathe. And again, you are keenly focused on what you have to pay attention to, because 5 seconds is very short. Now, after 2 minutes, the solid rocket fuel would be all used up, and this is when news stations would say, well, that was a successful launch. Everybody who knew better knew that those 3 engines had to keep running another 6.5 minutes. Very unforgiving. If one of those engines cut off early, we would not make it to space. Now, what you're seeing here is the engine shut off. You are instantly in that free fall. You're floating. We get rid of the orange tank. It's going 99% fast enough. That's not good enough. It burns up in the atmosphere and is never seen again. Now, this is a view from the rear of the shuttle. Cameras back there. Those 2 rectangles towards the front are the windows to our crew compartment. We're looking out on the payload bay, is what we called it, but it's really like the trunk of your car. It was huge. We were able to put laboratories, satellites, all kinds of things. Now, this is us trying to connect with that space station. As cool as it is to go 25 times the speed of sound, imagine what it's like to match your orbit with another vehicle going 25 times the speed of sound. Now, the docking module was sitting just right outside our rear windows. That's the whole upper deck of the space shuttle compartment. And I was controlling the docking mechanism during this time. We're looking at a target on the station as we come together ever so gently. Again, you can't just drive over to the space station. It's all matching orbits. Now, we had trained for hundreds of hours in a simulator for this moment. That's why all the congratulations and celebrations are going on. Now, I told you that weightlessness was annoying, and one reason is bad hair days. But as I am maneuvering that robotic arm and I'm moving the crew members around the space station as they're installing equipment, I've got my feet in these foot loops. I'm trying to hold steady. I've got a checklist right there that's flopping over to the page, away from the page that I need it. So it's an interesting time. Now this, you'll see how close the space station was to our crew compartment. That's Jeff installing some equipment right there. This is a view from the elbow of the robotic arm. This was the first time that a crew member, or one of the first times that I did not have access. I couldn't see the arm the entire time because it was blocked by the station. We had to come up with, for the first time, some virtual reality techniques. We had to come up with computer views and some tricks to make sure that I didn't go bumping into any equipment, because, I mean, how embarrassing, right? You go up there to build a space station and you break it. Now, my first flight, I was primary for a spacewalk. Had something broken, I would have gone outside to fix it. Now, here is Scott opening up the hatch to let those 2 spacewalkers in. Now, that hatch led to different places. If you closed it off, you could make an airlock where you could then do a spacewalk. But if you opened it up, it led to a long tunnel that led to an extra room where we stored most of the equipment that we were bringing up to install inside and outside the space station. Everything is tied down, Velcroed down, strapped down, because again, if it weren't, it would get lost, and heavens, we would have to fess up to the ground that we had lost yet another piece of equipment. Now, you can make a turn as you're going through that tunnel, and you could go into the space station itself. Here we are right at the threshold. At that time, it was so early, there were only 2 parts of the station, only 2 modules, 2 rooms. One had hatches all the way around it, and the idea was we would put other modules, other rooms up there in the future while this thing grew. We were all skeptical that it would work, but I would tell you that every one of those hatches is filled with another module, and in fact there are many, many modules up there. The space station is the size of a football field. Now here's Susan and Yuri. They're replacing some batteries. You know how annoying it is when your cell phone battery dies? Well, imagine if your space station batteries are dying. It was pretty dire. It was pretty important that we get up there when we did. Now here we are back at the space shuttle, and I want to show you the other part. Off to the left is the door to the bathroom. Right in front of it is the galley, or the little kitchen device. That's where we would take water that we would put back into the food that had all the water taken out, dehydrated food. All of the water that we ate and drank actually came from fuel cells. We brought up hydrogen, we brought up oxygen, and we combined them electronically so that we would get electricity and also the water that we ate and drank. There's no ceiling, there's no floor in space. I didn't expect this. You mentally pick which is the floor and which is the ceiling. I'll point out the exercise bike has no seat. Think about it. There's only a strap to keep me from floating off of it. That's a drop of water. Gravity is what limits the size of water droplets, of raindrops here on the Earth. Up in space, there is no limit to the size of the raindrop you can have. That's a sleeping bag. We could stick our sleeping bags, attach it anywhere. And on my first flight, I stuck it right underneath one of the overhead windows. The ground woke us up. I took off the sunshade, and this was the view that greeted me. And it's why it's first in here. It's my most memorable view. This is the Nile. Oh, you can keep running. This is the Nile River Delta running off the left side of the screen, the Arabian Peninsula, and certainly Qatar is in there as well. And just the beautiful blue water and sand was absolutely stunning to me. And you can also begin to see the power in the Earth's plates as they move and shift. That's the Himalaya mountains. It's formed because India is crashing into China, and those mountains are growing faster than your fingernails. Now this next view is one of my favorites. This is Venus and Mars, 2 planets that were rising before the sun. And I thought this was really cool to capture on video. And it was difficult because our cameras weren't so good then, and the light levels were changing so rapidly. We eventually got it right because we had 16 sunrises every single day. Now this is the best. This is the Earth at night. You'll see the Earth on, oh, you can keep going. The Earth is on the right side of the screen, and there is a tiny line just above it. That's the ionosphere. It is the edge of our atmosphere. That's the entire width of our atmosphere. It is a glowing blanket that encases the Earth. Now, our Earth is a big magnet, and it's really lucky. We're very lucky that that's the case because that magnetic field keeps out deadly solar radiation. Only at the poles of that magnet can that solar radiation sneak in. It ionizes the gas like a neon light bulb, and it makes it glow, and that's the auroras. So I got to fly through an aurora on my second space flight. Now, when it's time to come home, we set up the chairs again, we get back in those survival suits, and we slow down by 1% on the other side of the Earth where we want to land. We're in free fall, but now our orbit, we just barely dip into the atmosphere, and all the friction that's created is what brings us now to our landing spot. The shuttle took off like a rocket, but it landed like an airplane. It's important to realize it was an airplane without any engines. The crew had one and only one chance to make a landing. And it was a brick with wings. you would just dive at the end of the runway. You didn't even begin to pull up to slow down till 2,000 feet above the ground. You weren't even slow enough to lower the gear till mere seconds before you land. And so when you think about all the hundreds or thousands of things you need to worry about, when I press the gear down button, will gear actually come down? Now, as I look at this view here, as we come to a stop, 9 days on my first mission, 10 days on my second, to be a part, a pinnacle of a successful mission is indescribable. You're now also feeling gravity, things that had no weight for all that time. Now that little pencil feels heavy again. But for me, when I look at that view, I think about sitting there and thinking about how I just couldn't wait to share the experience with my husband and my family and my friends. And I would say that's the second best part about being an astronaut, is being able to share this with everybody. And I'm so delighted that I've gotten to share it all with you. Now, I'm here not to just share the experience of space, but I'm here to talk about leadership, decision-making, and governance, and the lessons that we can learn from space. Now that you have an idea, though, what it's like, I think that's a good starting point to take some lessons away. And to do this, I want to talk about two different mishaps in space. Two different. One was a mishap, the other was a tragedy. But I think it really highlights what's so different. In the first case, I want to talk about decision-making when the stakes are high and time is short. In 1997, it was a very interesting time in the U.S. space program. There were many changes taking place. You see, we had come back from Challenger. We were flying multiple missions a year. My class, I was selected in 1992, and my class was the first class that had international astronauts. We were bringing on board different cultures, different perspectives, different languages in some cases as a first language. And so we were incorporating all of that. And we were also gearing up to begin to construct the space station. And we knew that we were going to have to be agile. We were not going to have the luxury to train crews quite as thoroughly or as long as we had in the past. So there were lots of changes taking place, and there was a mission to deploy a satellite that was an experiment. It was called the Spartan. And the idea was that the crew would release this satellite. It would orbit the Earth for several days before the crew used the robotic arm and grabbed it again and brought it back home with lots of data and lots of learning. But during this time, there was a decision to actually eliminate some of the training classes for the crew. One of those training classes that was eliminated was the opportunity for the crew to use actual flight cameras, not just simulated views, but the actual flight cameras themselves, so that they could get used to setting the settings. Again, in the days of our iPhones and cell phones having fabulous cameras, this was before then. And so, in the interest of preparing for crews to make decisions when time is short, one of the things that we do is we invest a lot of resources in thinking about what could go wrong ahead of time. Remember I said we stop when we come to the first reasonable answer? Well, if we can think of all the different things that can go wrong, and we can have good answers in place, and we can let the crew practice those decision-making skills, we'll be okay. So, how would you know if the satellite was good? Well, they actually built in a procedure that when the crew released the satellite, it would spin. It would do a slow spin. Everybody would know it was working. Everybody would know it was fine. Well, what if it didn't spin? They had a procedure. The crew would go back in, grab the satellite, and so that they could figure out what was wrong. So we're marching along, the crew's marching along, ground control is marching along. The crew was working on activating the satellite, and the ground called them away to do something. When the ground called them back to the procedure, they accidentally skipped a step. They sent them to the wrong place in the procedure. And the step that they skipped was very important, and that was turn on the satellite. But it's okay, because we had those backup procedures in place, everything would be fine. So the crew got it, they released the satellite, no spin, but it's okay, they knew the answer. Go back in and grab the satellite. Only the cameras were not working the way the crew had anticipated, because again, they had a training class eliminated from their schedule. There was also internationals on the crew. There was a little bit of a language and culture difference. As they were coming in to get the satellite, the cameras, the lighting wasn't proper. The operator couldn't see the target. They ended up knocking the satellite into a spin. So there was no plan for this. Nobody anticipated this. So what's the first reasonable answer that mission control on the ground, that the crew, that everybody could come up with? Go get the satellite, right? Go chase the satellite. So the ground told the crew to go chase the satellite. They were firing engines, they were trying to get it. It's rotating, it's spinning, and they were unsuccessful in getting the satellite. And it turns out it's a very good thing that they were, because you see, subsequent analysis on the ground showed that the force of that spinning, if the arm had grabbed it, it very likely would have damaged the robotic arm. They may not have been able to release the robotic arm or to stow it. They would not have been able to close the payload bay doors, and there was a reasonable chance they would not have been able to come home. This is a perfect example of extremely brilliant, prepared, well-meaning people behaving like human brains do, stopping at the first reasonable answer and not thinking it through. And the lesson from all of this is that when times are changing very rapidly and the stakes are still very high, that is not the time to be innovating and cutting corners. That's the time that your rigor has to go up. That's the time when more focus needs to go into what can go wrong and how would I fix it. And the second lesson is understanding that that is human nature. I think I drive my husband crazy because I'm always thinking about what if this happens, what if this happens. I mean, it's something as simple as whether it's going out to dinner or taking a flight someplace, I always have option B and C for getting there if the flight gets canceled or something like that. I think I drive him crazy. But as an organization, you can ensure that everybody on the team is asking those same questions and having that focus. Now, the second case study that I'd like to bring up, obviously the first case I showed you, that was the only failed mission in NASA's history that was due to human error, not crew error, but human as a whole with ground control, the entire organization. The second case is, of course, a much more tragic, and it's the loss of Columbia. I talked to you before about the bureaucracy and the industry that space lives in, and bucking that bureaucracy can be very, very difficult. Before I talk about what went wrong with Columbia, I'd like to talk first about what went right. I don't think it's appropriate to talk about what went wrong without recognizing how amazing the crew was. So when the shuttle was coming in, I told you we would slow down by 1%. And as the shuttle was hitting the atmosphere, it had to maintain a pitch attitude to within 4 degrees. So slowing down, there's all this friction, there's all this energy being generated, all of this, and the shuttle has to maintain this attitude. And so this is obviously one of the things that the crew is paying attention to, the ground is paying attention to, and the crew knows that if there's any deviation from that, this is really bad. This is a bad day. And so what happened with Columbia is that there was some foam on that gas tank, that fuel tank I told you about. And there was a problem with that foam coming off for several launches prior to this mission. And one piece of that foam on launch actually poked a very big hole in the leading edge of the wing. Now, as you're coming in from at 25 times the speed of sound, there's all this friction as you hit the atmosphere, a lot of heat, incredible heat. Well, all of that heat now could get inside the space shuttle. And so it slowly started eating away wires and various different things as it was coming in. And at one point, they lost the hydraulic system for the shuttle that controlled its attitude, that maintained that attitude that was so important. And at that point, the shuttle went neutral. And we know from the panels that were recovered on the ground that in that 30 seconds or so between the time of loss of control of the shuttle and breakup of the shuttle, the crew, and this gives me goosebumps when I talk about it, but the crew was taking the right steps. They were enacting the procedures to restore the hydraulics. Now they couldn't be successful, but they didn't know that. But that's the legacy. You know, if I had not come home, that's the story I would want people to know about my mission, not just the tragedy of it all. So they were an amazing crew, and talk about decision making when time is short. They were on top of it. So getting back to the bigger lesson, the leadership, the NASA, the corporate governance lesson from this whole mission. If you read books on this, very often the message, the takeaway is, well, you need to empower the workers. You need to empower the people at the ground so that they will speak up and say when something's wrong. Because there were people that viewed that launch video and saw the foam coming off. Well, that's not quite the answer, because I'll tell you, in one example of that, there was an engineer who actually contacted the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Organization that controls the U.S. spy satellites, and asked them to train their satellites on Columbia to see if there was a problem with Columbia. And when their management found out, they got in trouble and they stopped that order immediately. They had decided that everything was fine. So how is that? How can that be where you have some of the most brilliant people on the planet and dedicated people on the planet making decisions like that? And they had days. This was not a 5-second issue. They had days to make good decisions, and yet what happened? Well, you've got to take a step back and go back to that bureaucracy. NASA was at a time when they had promised to Congress, to the White House, to the American people that they would have a space station built, operated, and running, an entire space station with many modules. It was going to be finished. And there were problems. There were slowdowns. We got a new administration in. And it's interesting because leading up to that, the former head of NASA, who is the longest serving head of NASA, had been there under George H. Bush as president, under Clinton, and then even under George W. Bush. So he knew his stuff. But they found out there was a budget a shortfall in the space station program by $4 billion. NASA's budget is not that big. $4 billion is a lot of money. So who do you think they replaced as head of NASA? A budget guy, a chief financial officer of the DOD. He's a good guy, and he knew how to fix it, right? We need to impose a deadline. The president convened a commission to look at the problem, and that's what they did. They said, we're going to draw this arbitrary line, and we're going to tell NASA that the space station has to be a certain configuration by a certain date. And if it's not, then it's over. Then we're stopping the space station construction. Now understand what that means for NASA. There was no other mission on the books being planned other than building the space station. This was an all-encompassing effort. If that happened, this was the end of NASA. And the new head of NASA, being a budget person, said, okay. So the entire organization is marching towards this arbitrary line. And then there were problems. There were hydrogen leaks in the main engines. Wow, you got to fix that. That took 6 months. Okay, we'll run 3 shifts with turning over the space station, with the space shuttles. We'll get them going. We'll get it going. And then there were more problems. And now they were going to miss it. And then somebody had an idea. They said, you know what? We actually have 4 space shuttles. One of them we can't use to build the space station because it was the first one, it was Columbia, it's not configured properly. We could, if we can get this one lab mission out of the way, we could send it back to get it reconfigured. We can still do it. We can meet this arbitrary deadline. We can do it. But we've got to get this lab mission out of the way. And so that's what they did. That was the plan. And so now the entire organization, screensavers are popping up talking about this deadline, the entire organization. So subconsciously, as a mission manager making a decision, you've got to decide, should I launch, is this mission good to go? Well, if I'm wrong and I launch it, then I've lost a crew, I've lost a vehicle. If I don't launch it and I'm wrong, this is the end of NASA. So what is the answer? Having people speak up? I mean, a logical conclusion would be that anything that stood a chance of working was good to go, because then NASA had a chance of continuing forward. So the answer is not empowering the workers. The answer is having the leadership to have enough knowledge of what it takes as a whole, enough knowledge of the missions, so that when they're given an arbitrary deadline, when they're given an arbitrary edict or directive or instruction, that they have the spine, the knowledge, and the backbone to say, no, I can't run my organization that way. If you want to kill it now, but I'm not going to run it inappropriately. Now, I think the head of NASA at the time, again, I think that there was a lack of awareness that enabled this situation to arise. But I will tell you that 20 years prior with Challenger, it was almost the same situation. Not technically or whatever, but you had leadership. In fact, 1 month before Challenger, the head of NASA, who had stepped down weeks before, was indicted by the Justice Department. You had a time when NASA had promised to the American people they'd be flying shuttles every week. It was crazy. And the leadership of NASA was not empowered. The leadership of NASA was not empowered to push back to stand up and say, I can't run my organization this way. And so what it comes down to is that when there's huge bureaucracy, when the stakes are high, what makes a good leader is different than when you're trying to do a new-to-the-world product, when you're trying to make an eBay or an Uber or a Lyft or something like that. These industries require not only a certain knowledge, but also a different backbone for their leadership. Now with that, I think we have a little bit of time for some questions.
Thank you very much for presentation. It was very interesting. I would like to ask, what was the name of the space shuttles you were flying with?
I flew on Discovery and Atlantis.
Space Center.
Great. Other questions? Please don't be shy.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. I'm Director of Public Health, but I would like to ask you, what's the main change in your personality after you came back to Earth? And what's the thing, the habit you get from astronauts you are still suffering to handle in your life? Thank you.
What the main thing is what I touched on earlier. It's actually two things. I think at NASA, I was surrounded by people who understood responsibility. I mean, every single person was responsible for a successful mission, whether it's the person, driving the van to take the crew to the flight, to everybody. Everybody recognized that they had a responsibility. And I think outside of NASA, what I've seen is people tend to do their jobs. This is my job, I've completed it, I've handed it off to somebody else, and there's this ownership that I think, I feel deeply no matter what I'm doing, whether it's planning a vacation, whether it's helping out the U.S. Embassy, or whether it's doing my job and working with my clients. And so I think that's made me very different. And the other thing is that I always have a plan B, C, and D for everything I do. So I think that's it.
Hi, this is Shada. I'm very honored to be here today and hear about your experience. As a woman in a masculine world, were you discouraged at any time?
There is not a single thing I've ever done that I thought I was a woman, whatever. I'm not a woman skydiver, I'm not a woman astronaut, I have gone through my life thinking of myself as me trying to do something. And it always is surprising when somebody will say, well, how many women astronauts are there? I have no idea. I have no idea. I don't look at them in that way. And so I will say perhaps the activities that I've been involved with, whether it's skydiving or space, people care about whether or not I can do my job. When somebody asks me to be on their skydiving team, all they care about is whether I can do the job. Will that help us win? Will I be safe in the sky, etc. So, and the same thing at NASA. I think when the stakes are high and performance matters, that's when you just don't see those differences. So I don't know. I'm sure that I have had barriers, but I pretty much ignore them and have plowed through them. Let me answer one other thing that's a little bit different. So when I was a girl, I remember watching Neil Armstrong step on the moon. I was at my grandmother's house with the black and white TV, and it was crazy. I remember that moment. I've talked to some of my colleagues who also remember that moment. These are men, and they'll say, oh, that was great. I saw that, and I knew I wanted to be an astronaut, and I got a helmet for Christmas, and I didn't ever want to take it off. I slept in it. It was great. I wanted to be an astronaut. So I watched Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. Women were not allowed to be an astronaut. We weren't allowed to dream of being an astronaut. I got a set of cardboard kitchen appliances for my bedroom so that I could pretend to keep house. That's what I got that year for Christmas. And so, in a sense, that's a barrier because it changed, the way I looked at the world. But I will also say this, when I was growing up, we were not a special family in the sense my father died when I was a year old. We had no money. My mother, of course, didn't have a college education because there was no reason for a girl to get an education. She was going to marry somebody who would take care of her. And there she was with 3 babies, no career, no job, no prospect. I was the least likely person to ever be an astronaut. We weren't allowed to be an astronaut, and never would I have the means. But I had a mother who knew that the way we were going to have a better life, and the way that was going to happen was education. Not just getting an education, but excelling at the education. And we were going to get the top grades, take the hardest classes, and do everything we could. So that eventually those doors opened. A door opened, women were allowed to be astronauts, and thank heavens I had the education and the credentials so that, and the boldness to have been skydiving, et cetera, that I could step through that door once it opened. Thank you so much.
Best talk ever. Well, I think we'll all agree about the talk and the Q&A. We're very inspirational. I'd like to thank Dr. Weber for coming out today. I'd like to thank our friends at the U.S. Embassy and Chargé Grant for their help in bringing such an amazing speaker to us today. So we're going to be taking some pictures up here as we hand this out. I will remind you that we do have a light lunch prepared at the back. There'll be more Dean's Lecture speakers for the rest of the term, and I would like to thank you all for coming out. And let's again thank Dr. Weber.